This is Lesson 28.1, Postwar Europe and the Origins of the Cold War. Why was World War II followed so quickly by the Cold War? And this is a very comprehensive lesson, so it covers quite a few of the College Board topics. For example, College Board Topic 9.1, Contextualizing Cold War and Contemporary Europe. Explain the context in which the Cold War developed, spread, and ended in Europe. Total war and political instability in the first half of the 20th century gave way to a polarized state order during the Cold War and eventually to efforts at transnational union. As World War II ended, a Cold War between the liberal democratic West and the communist East began, lasting nearly half a century. College Board Topic 9.2, Rebuilding Europe. Explain how economic developments resulted in economic, political, and cultural change after World War II. Marshall Plan funds from the United States financed an extensive reconstruction of industry and infrastructure and stimulated an extended period of growth in Western and Central Europe, often referred to as the economic miracle, which increased the economic and cultural importance of consumerism. College Board Topic 9.3, The Cold War. Explain the causes, events, and effects of the Cold War in the period following World War II. Despite efforts to maintain international cooperation through the newly created United Nations, deep-seated tensions between the USSR and the West led to the division of Europe, which was referred to in the West as the Iron Curtain. The Cold War played out on a global stage and involved propaganda campaigns, covert actions, limited hot wars in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and an arms race with the threat of nuclear war. And finally, College Board Topic 9.4, Two superpowers emerge. Explain the economic and political consequences of the Cold War for Europe. The United States exerted a strong military, political, and economic influence in Western Europe, leading to the creation of world monetary and trade systems and geopolitical alliances, including NATO. Countries east of the Iron Curtain came under the military, political, and economic domination of the Soviet Union within the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, and the Warsaw Pact. Place, Europe, of course. Time frame, 1945 to about 1965, and a little beyond even. Key concepts of post-war Europe and origins of the Cold War. There are so many. The Tehran Conference, 1943. The Yalta Conference, March 1945. The Potsdam Conference, July 1945. Containment, the Iron Curtain, NATO, and let's include the Warsaw Pact. Key people of post-war Europe and origins of the Cold War. Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, George C. Marshall, and Yuri Gagarin. Intro. Europe was shattered. War criminals had to be held accountable for what they had done. Millions of people had been displaced by the loss of their homes. Once Hitler was defeated, the Allies found it difficult to keep cooperating. Specifically, the U.S. and Britain disagreed with the Soviet Union. Each had different goals. Each had misunderstandings of the other's desires. The U.S. and the USSR both emerged from the war as superpowers. They competed around the world for military and political supremacy. By 1949, almost every country in Europe was a member of either the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc. And this Cold War would last another 42 years thereabouts. East and West had worked well together when there was a common enemy. As the war drew to a close, long-standing hostilities reemerged. This included mutual distrust. It included security concerns. It included antagonistic desires for economic supremacy, political domination, and territorial control. The legacies of the Second World War. The losses of World War II were astronomical. Entire cities and rural areas were in ruins. Infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, factories, railroads, farms, etc., were gone. The human cost was immense. 20 million Soviets were dead. 9 to 11 million had died in concentration camps. 6 million Jews, 220,000 gypsies, etc. 1 out of every 5 Poles had died, including 3 million of the 3.25 million Polish Jews. Germany lost 5 million, 2 million of which were civilians. France lost 350,000 civilians. The U.S. lost 400,000 soldiers and sailors. Total human cost of the war was over 50 million. Literally millions of people had been made homeless during the war. 25 million homeless in the USSR, 20 million homeless in Germany, 30 million homeless in Central and Eastern Europe. Once the war ended, the number of homeless swelled even more. 13 million more ethnic Germans either fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe. The Nazis had brought people from all over Europe to Germany to be used as forced labor. Now they wanted to return home. Concentration camp survivors needed a place. Lots of orphaned children needed care. Freed prisoners of war were coming back to nothing. All of these people became known collectively as DPs, Displaced Persons. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration provided food and shelter. They opened 760 DP camps between 1945 and 1947. A few were special Jewish DP camps just for Jews. The UNRRA spent $10 billion to house, clothe, and feed the DPs. Many did not want to return to their homelands. Soviets viewed Russians who had spent too much time in the West with great suspicion. Many faced prison terms in Siberian gulags and execution if they returned. Many faced persistent anti-Semitism back in their homelands. Many displaced Jews left Europe altogether. 350,000 left for the newly created nation of Israel after 1948. Another 100,000 emigrated to the U.S. and other South American and British Commonwealth countries. The last DP camp didn't close until 1957. Germany and Austria were divided among the 4 Allies into 4 occupational zones. The Soviets extracted large reparations from their zones. From their German zone, they seized factories and equipment. They even tore up railroad tracks and sent the rails back for use back in the USSR. And this was all perfectly legal and done according to agreements made at the Yalta Conference. They also extracted reparations from Romania and Hungary, former German allies. War criminals and collaborators. The total number of people found guilty of war crimes throughout Europe was 100,000. Many more received indictments. Retribution in Eastern Europe was very harsh. Acts of retribution happened for years. Unofficial executions killed 25,000 in France and Italy. Occupational authorities set up denazification procedures. The first priority was to hold war criminals responsible. The second was to eradicate Nazi ideology throughout Europe. The Nuremberg Trials. 12 war criminals were sentenced to death and 10 more were put in prison. These trials finally revealed the full systematic horror of the Holocaust. It also marked the last time that the 4 allies would work together to punish Nazis. The prosecution of war criminals slowed down in all countries after the initial zeal. The German people were against it. Former Nazis often avoided conviction by cooperating with the new governments. And there was a need to make political stability a priority. Also, the huge numbers of people implicated in these war crimes was overwhelming to the system. And many former Nazis went on to freedom and prosperity, even working for their own governments. And this happened at about the same rate among all the victors. The peace settlement and Cold War origins. Creating a lasting peace settlement proved very difficult. Diverging interests of the victors soon revealed themselves. There was much old hostility between the East and the West. Military developments, wartime agreements, old political and ideological differences were still strong. During the war, the Allies had deliberately avoided discussing post-war aims. But in 1943, it was clear that these things had to be discussed. Leaders met in Tehran in November 1943. The Soviets wanted a second front opened up in France, which the Allies agreed to. But the delay in following through with this agreement made Stalin more distrustful. The second front would determine the basic shape of Europe for decades. The Allied leaders met again at Yalta in February 1945. The Soviets had rolled into many countries by that time, but the Allies had stalled in front of the Rhine River. These factors put Stalin in a much better negotiating position. They agreed to split Germany into 4 occupational zones, and the USSR's zone would pay heavy war reparations. Poland. Eastern Poland would remain under Soviet occupation. Western Poland would get some of Germany as compensation. New governments in Soviet-occupied Europe would be freely elected, and they would also be friendly to the Soviet Union. That was the agreement. The Yalta Agreement broke down almost immediately. The process is a good lesson in global politics. Communist parties took control of Bulgaria and Poland right away. The Soviets allowed other socialist and leftist parties and coalition governments in the other occupied countries. But they reserved key government posts for Moscow-trained communists. The third Big Three conference was the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Harry Truman represented the U.S. because FDR had died. Truman demanded immediate free elections throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Stalin absolutely refused. There were many reasons. He feared that any freely elected government in Eastern Europe could too easily result in an independent and hostile government. The Soviet Union, understandably, after losing 20 million people, could not allow such a thing ever again. Stalin had lived through 2 devastating wars, and he was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly states around the USSR. He also saw the expansion of communism as a contributor to the security of the USSR. And he also believed that only communists made dependable friends. There's a common misperception that we need to clear up right away. The U.S. was in no position to enforce Truman's demands. War with the USSR at this point was absolutely out of the question. West versus East. The U.S. and Great Britain may have been a little harsh with the Soviet Union at first. Truman cut off aid to the Soviet Union the second Japan surrendered in September 1945. In October, Truman said that the U.S. would never recognize any government established by force against the will of its people. On March the 5th, 1946, Winston Churchill made a speech in Fulton, Missouri, in which he said an iron curtain had fallen across Europe. Churchill is credited with inventing the phrase Iron Curtain with reference to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. But actually, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had used it in reference to the Soviet Union already. And numerous books had already used the term in reference to the Soviet Union as far back as 1920. But in 1946, Churchill used it to refer to the Soviet Union and the satellite states that it was forming. The Soviet Union actually had some popular support in Eastern Europe. After all, they had at least gotten rid of the hated and ruthless Nazis. But it wasn't enough to carry the day in most free elections, so they weren't going to have many of those. Instead of holding free elections in Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and Hungary, Communist Party members repressed their liberal opponents. They rigged phony elections, they established communist regimes, they purged non-communist representatives from coalition governments, and this was all backed by Moscow. And by 1948, all these countries had one-party dictatorships. Czechoslovakia was that exception of hope for just a little while. The Communist Party actually won the largest number of seats in free elections and formed a coalition government. Then all the non-communist ministers resigned in February 1948. And then the Communist Party took over and started setting up Stalinism. That's communism, Stalin style. Western observers found this turn of events particularly alarming because Moscow didn't even have to engineer this one. This was done completely in-house. Communism also seemed to be enjoying a little too much success in Western Europe and in Asia. Communists won 19% of the vote in Italy in 1946, and communists won 28% of the vote in France in 1946. There are 4 ways that we can describe these communist parties in the West. Number 1, they were, of course, highly critical of U.S. involvement in Western Europe. Number 2, they staged large strikes against their own governments. Number 3, they used violent rhetoric, which was always alarming, and they had been doing this for decades and decades, as we know. And number 4, they were well organized. The USSR seemed intent on exporting communism to the rest of the world. A violent civil war was going on in Greece. A violent civil war was also going on in China, as we know. The Soviets threatened to expand into Turkey, and a new policy to deal with all of this seemed vital. The U.S. responded with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and it contained the policy of containment. We're going to allow communism to remain where it already is, but we're going to contain it wherever it tries to spread. We're going to use 3 means to do that: diplomatic, economic, and military. The policy of containment would be tested many times over the next few years. Sometimes it would succeed, sometimes it would fail. The first test of Truman's containment policy: financial aid to Turkey and to the non-communist fighters in the Greek Civil War. Economic aid was one of the stated platforms of containment, and it worked. Greece and Turkey remained within the Western Bloc, and it looked like this containment idea was going to work great. Then the U.S. lost its monopoly on atomic weapons in 1949. The USSR successfully tested their own atomic bomb. As a result, the U.S. experienced a Red Scare. I'd like to make this point to my world history students. We don't just disapprove of communism. We don't just hate communism. We fear communism, and we shouldn't do that. Politicians know that this fear can be used to manipulate us. Just check out this YouTube link of the debate between Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock. That's not just the same clip playing over and over. That's her saying radical liberal multiple times. History has shown, though, that communist dictatorships and command economies eventually collapse under their own weight. But that hadn't happened yet in 1949, so nobody could predict it. At the time, communism's message of equality and freedom from the bourgeoisie exploitation appealed to millions of people around the world. The U.S. engaged in an anti-communist moral crusade throughout public life. The U.S. responded with the military aspect of its containment policy. It poured money into defense spending and in nuclear weapons development. The Marshall Plan extension of our containment policy. Western Europe was on the verge of economic collapse for quite a while after World War II. It was economically vulnerable to communist interference from the USSR. And Truman put Secretary of State George C. Marshall in charge of the Marshall Plan and named the Marshall Plan for him. And this was a package of $13 billion in economic aid to 15 Western countries. It lasted 4 years. It helped millions of people. It got Europe back on its feet economically. And its purpose was to bring about conditions in which free institutions could exist. And it was one of the most successful foreign policy programs in history. The USSR rejected the U.S. offer to extend the Marshall Plan to Eastern Bloc countries. Instead, the USSR responded with their own economic plan to help Eastern Bloc countries rebuild. And this was called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. It was not as generous. It was much less successful, but it lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Once again, the Truman Doctrine of containment seemed to be working for the U.S. The Berlin Airlift. Germany, as we know, had been divided into 4 occupational zones. Likewise, the city of Berlin, lying completely within the Soviet occupational zone, had also been divided into 4 occupational zones, 3 of which were administered by the West. None of the 4 victorious occupational countries were supposed to replace the currency in Germany, according to our peace agreement with the Soviet Union. We violated that agreement by changing the currency in our 3 Western occupational zones of Germany and in the Western zone of Berlin. The purpose was to establish a Western German state sympathetic to the U.S. Stalin saw this move as deliberate Western expansion. He was also alarmed by the growing ties among Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It looked to him as if a Western bloc was forming up against the Soviet Union. So Stalin blocked off all traffic through the Soviet zone of Germany to and from Berlin. And this effectively cut the non-Soviet occupational zones of Berlin off from the other non-Soviet occupational zones of Germany. By isolating West Berlin from the other Allied occupational zones of Germany, Stalin was hoping to accomplish 3 things. Number 1, to force the U.S. back to negotiating these new developments. Number 2, to win concessions from the West. And number 3, to reunify Berlin under Soviet control. The Western Allies organized a massive airlift to fly over the blockade. It was round the clock. It supplied West Berliners with food and other provisions. It lasted 10 months, and it broke Stalin's blockade. After 324 days, the Soviets finally had to admit defeat and open the roads back up. The policy of containment now had 3 big wins on its record: Greece and Turkey, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin Airlift. And it also had 1 big loss. The Soviets had atomic weapons. The consequences of the Berlin Airlift were huge. It paved the way for 2 separate German states in 1949. The Federal Republic of Germany, known as the BRD, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, which we also call West Germany, and it was aligned with the U.S. And then you had the German Democratic Republic, the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, which we called East Germany, and that was aligned with the USSR. A little known fact, many people liked the idea of a divided Germany, given its history of aggression. Also, the Berlin Airlift seemed to show that containment worked. Its success strengthened U.S. resolve to maintain a strong presence. NATO was formed in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was an anti-Soviet military alliance. West Germany was even allowed to join in 1955. West Germany was even allowed to rebuild its military as a new NATO member. And the Soviet Union responded in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact. Europe was now divided between 2 opposing blocs. The Cold War spread across the world. In Korea, there was a war that killed 5 million people, 10% of Korea's population. Communist North Korea, with Russian and Chinese backing, invaded South Korea in 1950. China got directly involved when UN forces pushed North Korean forces right up to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. The war was indecisive. An armistice was signed in 1953. There's never been a peace treaty. There have been 2 Koreas, 1 communist and totalitarian, 1 capitalist and democratic, ever since. The Cold War encompassed all other aspects of society. It fostered a nuclear arms race. It fostered a space race. It fostered a computer revolution. And it fostered stunning advances in science and technology. Big science in the nuclear age. World War II saw huge gains in modern weaponry. The development of the atomic bomb, radar, rocketry, jets, early computers, the British Colossus, and the American ENIAC. Now the Cold War ushered in an age of big science. What is characterized by the new big science model? Labs are large bureaucratic organizations. They're extremely expensive. They get large-scale financing from governments and corporations. They combine theoretical work with sophisticated engineering. They tackle extremely difficult problems, and they improve everything from weapons to consumer products. Cold War applications of big science. After 1945, 25% of all scientists and engineers in the West were working full-time on better ways to kill people. Imagine the waste of talent. There were probably even a greater percentage in the Soviet Union working on ways to kill people. This was the arms race. These scientists and engineers produced huge military advances: missiles and rockets, nuclear submarines, spy satellites. Such systems required huge scientific and engineering breakthroughs in order to work. Since the 1960s, mankind has possessed the ability to destroy itself many times over. Big science and the space race. The space race was a combination of three things: sophisticated science, lavish spending, and military needs. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 into space using long-range rockets that had been designed in their nuclear weapons program. Sputnik 1 was about the size of a beach ball. It weighed about 183 pounds. It orbited the globe in about 98 minutes. And its success captured the world's imagination. And Sputnik 1 was extremely embarrassing and humiliating for the U.S. World opinion at the time was that the Soviets had permanently surpassed the U.S. technologically. So NASA was founded in 1958. The Soviets followed up Sputnik in 1961 by having the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, circle the globe. NASA's sending men to the moon 5 times from 1969 to 1972 can be viewed as an act of defiance and revenge against Soviet accomplishments in space. Big science and computing. The ENIAC and Colossus computers of the 1940s were massive, with huge amounts of vacuum tubes. In 1947, the transistor was invented, and this was a device that could take tiny electronic signals and amplify or switch those tiny signals into electrical power. It replaced the vacuum tube. It's the main building block of all electronic components, including personal electronics like radios, kitchen appliances, vacuum cleaners, etc. In the 1960s, the integrated circuit, the microchip, was invented. With the IC, you could fit many transistors on one flat piece. Nowadays, that flat piece can be the size of a fingernail and contain several billion transistors. By the 1960s, computers were indispensable tools for production of all kinds: military, commercial, scientific. These advances made PCs and cell phones possible. Big science and ordinary people. The agricultural research conducted by big science greatly increased the world's food supply. Farming has become increasingly more industrialized and efficient, requiring fewer people. Today, the percentage of people who list their occupation in the U.S. Census as farmer are less than 1%. Big science has been applied to industrial processes that make all kinds of consumer goods. They're less expensive and they're more available. The paradox of big science. Big science has contributed enormously to our destructive and killing capacity. But big science has also contributed enormously to our material well-being and entertainment.